They fired me on a Thursday. By Monday, federal shipments from over 70 suppliers had ground to a halt, and nobody could figure out why. Spoiler, I knew exactly why. My name is Camille Hartley, and until 6 days ago, I was the chief logistics architect at Virion Systems, the company responsible for coordinating the supply chain network for the Departments of Energy, Health and Defense. What the board didn't realize when they called me into that glass-walled conference room was that I wasn't just another executive they could discard. I was the architect and guardian of Helix Grid, the multi-billion-dollar intersectoral supply chain coordination system that kept everything from CDC vaccines to Pentagon microchips flowing across the country. Let me take you back to the beginning. I joined Virion when it was just 20 people working out of a converted warehouse in Salt Lake City. The company had been founded by Colin Braith, a former NASA engineer with wild, unkempt hair and a vision that bordered on the prophetic. The government doesn't need better products, he told me during my interview. It needs a better nervous system to move those products. I was 33 then, with 2 master's degrees in systems engineering and logistics architecture, plus 5 years at Amazon building their fulfillment algorithms. Colin hired me to turn his vision into reality. "Build me something the government can't live without," he said, and so I did. For the first year, I lived on energy drinks and 4 hours of sleep. I designed Helix Grid from scratch, creating a framework that could track, route, and optimize shipments across dozens of federal agencies. The core of my design was something I called the Node Lock Protocol, a security measure that required dual authentication for any significant system changes, one from a government representative and one from the system architect, me. At the time, it seemed like a sensible security measure. In retrospect, it was the best insurance policy I could have created. By our 3rd year, Virion had grown to over 200 employees. We had a real office now, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Wasatch Mountains. Colin's vision and my architecture had secured us contracts with 3 major government departments. We were no longer just a promising startup. We were becoming essential infrastructure. I remember the day we landed the 7-year, $3.2 billion contract with the Department of Defense. Colin popped champagne in the office, and we all stayed until midnight celebrating. What most of my colleagues didn't know was that the government had specifically requested me as a named individual in the contract, not Virion me. The Hartley Protocol, they called it internally. I was flattered, but I didn't fully appreciate the implications at the time. As we grew, the company culture began to shift. Colin, always more of a visionary than a CEO, started to feel the pressure from our investors. We had taken on several rounds of funding, and the board was pushing for faster growth, more contracts, more revenue. By year 5, Colin made the decision that would ultimately change everything. He sold his controlling interest to Blackcrest Capital, a private equity firm specializing in government contractors. "It's the right move for the company," he told me over drinks the night before the announcement. "They have the connections to take us where we need to go." I could see the conflict in his eyes, the mixture of pride and loss. "They're keeping me on as CTO for 3 years, and they've agreed to honor everyone's equity arrangements." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Including yours. Camille, you'll get everything you earned." 2 months later, Colin was pushed into a strategic advisor role, effectively sidelined. Blackcrest installed their own CEO, Elena Bryce, a Harvard MBA with sleek dark hair, always pulled into a tight bun, and a reputation for optimizing assets. She arrived with a team of consultants and a mandate to prepare the company for an eventual IPO. From our first meeting, I knew Elena and I would never see eye to eye. "I've been reviewing your system architecture," she said, though I doubted she could distinguish a distributed ledger from a database. "It seems overbuilt, too many redundancies, too many authorization checks. In today's world, logistics is about speed and flexibility. In national security," I countered, "it's about reliability and control." She smiled thinly. "Well, we'll have to find the right balance, won't we?" Within 6 months, Elena had replaced most of Colin's original executive team. The new CTO, Mason Kerr, was a former management consultant who described himself as an AI expert in logistics, despite having never built an actual system. He wore expensive suits and spoke in buzzwords, dismissing my concerns about system integrity as legacy thinking. "Blockchain and AI are the future of logistics," he declared in our first architecture review. "We need to upgrade Helix Grid to stay competitive." "Competitive with whom?" I asked. "We have exclusive contracts with 3 federal departments. Our system handles classified routing information for military hardware. You can't just upgrade it like it's a smartphone app." Mason smiled condescendingly. "That's why we need fresh perspectives. Camille, the board agrees it's time for Helix Grid 2.0. I knew then that I was fighting a losing battle, but I also knew something they didn't without my authentication. Any significant changes to the core system would trigger the node lock protocol. So I played along, making the internal changes they wanted while maintaining the critical security features at the federal interface level. For months, this uneasy arrangement continued. I watched as Elena and Mason presented my system to government officials as if they had built it themselves. I sat through meetings where they promised revolutionary upgrades that were either technically impossible or would violate our security protocols, and all the while, I kept my head down and continued to refine and strengthen Helix Grid's core functionality. What kept me going was the knowledge that in just over a year, my equity would fully vest. As one of the earliest employees, I had been granted substantial stock options, which following our most recent valuation were worth approximately $900 million, not bad for 6 years of work, even if the last year had been increasingly miserable. Then came that Thursday. I was in my office, reviewing routing protocols for a new vaccine distribution program, when my assistant received a call. "Ms. Bryce would like to see you in the executive conference room," she said, looking uncomfortable. "Right away." When I arrived, Elena was seated at the head of the table, with Mason to her right, and a woman I recognized as the company's lead counsel to her left. 3 other executives I barely knew filled out the remaining seats. "Camille, thank you for joining us," Elena said with that practiced corporate smile. "Please, have a seat." I remained standing. "What's this about?" Elena's smile didn't waver. "We're implementing some organizational changes that we believe will better position Virion for the future. As part of this restructuring, we've made the difficult decision to eliminate the chief logistics architect position." I felt a coldness spread through my chest, but I kept my face neutral. "Eliminate my position 1 week before my equity vests." The lawyer spoke up. "The timing is unfortunate, but these decisions are based solely on organizational needs." "Of course," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "And who will be managing Helix Grid moving forward? It requires a level of expertise that—" "We've created a new division under CTO oversight," Mason interrupted. "A team approach rather than centralizing knowledge in one person. It's more resilient." I looked at each of them in turn. These people who thought they could discard me and still maintain the system I had built with my blood and tears. "You do understand that per our federal contracts, any significant system changes require my authentication, correct?" Mason chuckled. "Actually, we've already migrated those permissions to the CTO office. Purely administrative. The transition will be seamless." And that's when I knew they had made a fatal mistake. They hadn't migrated anything. They couldn't not without my approval, and not without government counter-authentication. What they had done was create a shadow system that they thought could bypass me, but which would inevitably trigger the security protocols I had built into the very foundation of Helix Grid. I smiled. "I see. Well, I appreciate your candor. Should I clear out my office now?" Elena looked relieved at my apparent acceptance. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items. Your final compensation package will be sent to you by the end of day." She stood, extending her hand. "We wish you all the best in your future endeavors. Camille." I didn't take her hand. Instead, I simply nodded and turned to leave. As I reached the door, I paused and looked back. One more thing. When things start to break and they will, please don't call me. I walked out of Virion for the last time that afternoon, carrying a small box of personal effects. My assistant was crying. A few of the engineers looked stunned. Most people, though, kept their heads down. In corporate America, proximity to the fallen can be dangerous. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't have to. The system was designed to protect itself from exactly this type of situation, where an unauthorized entity attempted to make changes without proper authentication. When Monday morning came, and Mason's team tried to implement their first upgrade, Helix Grid would recognize the absence of my authentication signature and automatically enter protection mode. It would continue running existing operations, but refuse any new configurations or routing changes. At first, they probably wouldn't even notice. Existing shipments would continue as planned, but new orders would fail to enter the system. Rerouting requests would be quietly declined. Within hours, the backlog would begin to build. By midday, someone at the Pentagon or CDC would start asking questions. By the end of the day, the system would effectively be frozen. I spent the weekend in a state of calm detachment. I went hiking in the mountains, something I hadn't had time to do in months. I called my parents and told them I'd been let go, but assured them I would be fine. I even went on a date Saturday night with an architectural photographer I'd matched with weeks earlier, but had been too busy to meet. Throughout it all, I kept my phone on silent, knowing it would start ringing soon enough. The first email came at 6:42 Monday morning from Mason. Experiencing some issues with the supply routing modules. Could use your insight. $1,000 hour consulting fee available immediately. I didn't respond. By 10:15, the fee had increased to $5,000 hour. By noon, Elena herself had emailed, offering $15,000 hour to resolve some unexpected system behaviors. Still, I said nothing. On Tuesday morning, I received a call from General Richardson at the Department of Defense, one of my primary contacts during the system development. "Camille, what the hell is happening at Virion? We've got shipments stalled across 14 states, and nobody over there seems to know how to fix it." "I'm not with Virion anymore, General," I said calmly. "They terminated my position last Thursday." There was a long pause. "They what?" "Without consulting us. You're named in our contract." "I'm aware." Another pause. "I need to make some calls. Don't go anywhere." I spent the rest of Tuesday setting up my new company, Hartley Nexus Group, specializing in decentralized supply chain systems with built-in ethical safeguards. I leased a small office space, filed the necessary paperwork, and began drafting a business plan. I also consulted with a lawyer about my rights regarding the equity that should have vested. As I suspected, Virion's timing was deliberate and likely actionable. By Wednesday, the situation had escalated dramatically. The New York Times ran a story about unexplained delays in federal supply chains, citing anonymous sources who claimed that critical medical and defense shipments were being held up by technical issues. CNN followed with a more detailed piece mentioning Virion by name and questioning the company's ability to manage critical infrastructure. That afternoon, Elena called me directly. I let it go to voicemail. She called again and again. On the fourth attempt, I picked up. "Camille," she said, her voice tightly controlled but with an undercurrent of panic. "We need to talk." "I believe we said everything we needed to say last Thursday," I replied. "This isn't productive," she snapped. "Whatever point you're trying to make, you've made it. Now we need to fix this situation before it causes real harm." "I'm not causing any harm," I said truthfully. "The system is functioning exactly as designed. It's protecting itself from unauthorized modifications." "Don't play games. People's lives could be at stake." "Then perhaps you shouldn't have fired the one person who understood how to maintain the system properly. That seems like the irresponsible decision here." Elena took a deep breath. I could almost hear her counting to 10. "What will it take to get you back in here to fix this?" "I'm not interested in consulting for Virion." "Name your price." "It's not about money." "Then what your job back fine. Full reinstatement, increased authority, whatever you want." I let the silence stretch between us. "Camille, please, the board is meeting in an hour. the government is threatening to invoke national security provisions. Just tell me what you want." "I don't want to fix your system," I said finally, "because from my perspective, the system isn't broken. It was designed to prevent unauthorized users from making potentially catastrophic changes. That's exactly what it's doing. So you're just going to let this continue out of spite." "Not spite, principle. You and Mason thought you could discard me and still benefit from my work. You were wrong. Actions have consequences. Elena, I'm just not the one who has to face them." I hung up and turned my phone off. The next morning, I was having coffee at my kitchen table when there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I found two men in dark suits standing on my porch. "Ms. Hartley." "I'm Agent Collins with the FBI, and this is Agent Ramirez. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the Virion situation." I invited them in and spent the next 2 hours explaining exactly how Helix Grid worked, why it had entered protection mode, and what would be required to restore full functionality. I was careful to emphasize that I had not taken any actions to disable the system. It was responding automatically to unauthorized access attempts. "So to be clear," Agent Collins said, reviewing his notes, "the system is still processing existing orders but won't accept new ones because it can't authenticate the changes being attempted." "Correct. It's a security feature, not a flaw. Imagine if a hostile entity gained control of Virion and tried to redirect military shipments. This is precisely the scenario the node lock protocol was designed to prevent." Agent Ramirez leaned forward. "And how would one restore full functionality?" "Proper authentication would need to be established. That would require either my signature key or a complete system override by both the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security. The latter would essentially mean rebuilding the system from the ground up, which would take months." The agents exchanged glances. "Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Hartley," Collins said as they prepared to leave. "We may have more questions later." "Of course," I replied. "I'm always happy to assist federal authorities." After they left, I turned my phone back on to find 17 missed calls and 32 text messages. The most recent was from General Richardson. "DOD legal reviewing Virion contract violation. Call me." I did. The conversation was brief but satisfying. The Department of Defense was invoking clauses related to national security and contractual non-performance. They were taking control of the situation. By Friday, 8 days after my termination, the government had revoked Virion's contracts and announced a temporary federalization of the supply chain management system. Elena and Mason were placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and a team of government engineers was brought in to maintain basic operations while a more permanent solution was developed. That solution, as it turned out, would be Hartley Nexus Group. 3 weeks after Virion's implosion, I received a request to submit a proposal for a next-generation logistics coordination system with enhanced security features and distributed authentication protocols. The initial contract value, $2.8 billion over 8 years. 6 months later, my company had grown to over 200 employees, including many former Virion engineers who had jumped ship as the company collapsed. We had secured contracts with 5 federal departments and were developing a commercial version of our system for private sector use. My lawsuit against Virion for wrongful termination and equity fraud had been settled for an undisclosed sum that more than made up for the $900 million I had lost. As for Virion, the company filed for bankruptcy 4 months after my departure. Blackcrest Capital took a significant write-down, and several board members faced SEC investigations for their roles in the collapse. Mason disappeared from the industry entirely. Elena, last I heard, was working as an advisor for a small agritech firm in Iowa. I was invited to give the keynote address at the Defense Logistics Innovation Conference that December. Standing before an audience of military officers, government officials, and industry leaders, I reflected on the lessons of the Virion incident. Security isn't just about code, I told them. It's about the power structures embedded in our systems, when a single person's removal can bring down a national infrastructure network. That's not a technical failure, it's an organizational design failure. At Hartley Nexus, we're building systems that are not only technologically resilient but also organizationally sound, with distributed authority and ethical guidelines built into their very architecture. I paused, looking out at the audience. The future of logistics isn't about moving goods faster or more efficiently. It's about moving them more responsibly, with systems that serve the public good and resist both technical failures and human corruption. That's the kind of security we should all be striving for. The applause was gratifying, but not as much as the knowledge that I had turned a personal setback into a chance to build something better, not just for me, but for everyone who depends on these invisible systems that keep our world functioning. They fired me on a Thursday. By the following Thursday, their company was in freefall. Today, I'm building the future they were too short-sighted to imagine. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't just success. It's creating something that makes the world a little better than you found it, even if you have to freeze a few supply chains along the way. I wasn't planning to go back to Virion headquarters again, but the subpoena didn't leave me much choice. 13 months after my unceremonious exit, I found myself walking through the once familiar lobby, now noticeably emptier. The receptionist didn't recognize me, which wasn't surprising given the company's high turnover rate since the incident, as the media had taken to calling it. "I'm here for the deposition," I told her. She nodded and made a quick call. "Someone will be down to escort you shortly." While I waited, I studied the changes. The sleek promotional videos that once played on wall-mounted screens had been replaced by generic corporate stock footage. The Virion logo, once prominently displayed in brushed aluminum, had been reduced to a modest vinyl decal. Cost-cutting measures were evident everywhere. "Ms. Hartley," the voice came from behind me. I turned to find Daniel Weiss, Virion's new legal counsel. He was younger than I expected, probably fresh from law school and thrown into the corporate disaster zone that Virion had become. "Mr. Weiss," I acknowledged. "Shall we?" He led me to the elevators, swiping his badge with the nervous energy of someone who had been hearing stories about me for months. We rode in silence to the 14th floor, where the executive offices had once been. Now, it appeared to have been converted into a legal war room. Tables were covered with documents, and harried-looking paralegals moved between workstations with the desperate efficiency of people trying to bail out a sinking ship. "In here, please," Weiss said, opening a door to what had once been Elena's private conference room. Inside, a court reporter was setting up equipment. 2 lawyers I didn't recognize sat on one side of the table, while a familiar face occupied the other. Jeremy Talbot, the outside counsel I had retained for my wrongful termination suit. "Camille," Jeremy greeted me with a warm handshake. "Right on time." After the preliminary formalities and swearing in, the questioning began. Virion's attorneys wanted to establish a timeline of events leading up to what they carefully referred to as the system limitation event. Their strategy was transparent. They were trying to prove that I had deliberately sabotaged Helix Grid, which would violate both my employment contract and potentially federal law. "Ms. Hartley," the lead attorney began, "could you explain in layman's terms how the node lock protocol works?" I spent the next 40 minutes detailing the technical specifications, careful to use precise language that would be captured in the transcript. I explained how the system required dual authentication for major changes, one from an authorized government representative and one from the designated system architect me. And was this protocol documented in the system specifications provided to Virion management? It was documented in extensive detail in the technical architecture documents, the federal contract requirements, and the system security protocols. I personally walked Elena Bryce and Mason Kerr through these specifications 3 times during their first month at Virion. Yet they believed they could transfer your authentication authority to the CTO's office. "What they believed isn't something I can speak to," I replied. "What I know is that such a transfer would require my explicit authorization and countersignature from federal representatives. Neither was obtained." The questioning continued for hours, delving into increasingly technical details. The attorneys seemed frustrated by their inability to find any smoking gun that would suggest deliberate sabotage, because there wasn't one. During a break, Jeremy pulled me aside. "They're flailing," he said quietly. "The DoD investigation already cleared you of wrongdoing, and their own technical experts have confirmed that the system behaved exactly as it was designed to. This is just a desperate attempt to shift blame." "How much longer will this drag on?" I asked. "Not much. The bankruptcy trustees are pushing for a global settlement of all outstanding claims. Word is, they want to sell what's left of Virian's intellectual property and be done with this mess." When we resumed, the questioning took an unexpected turn. "Ms. Hartley, were you aware that Colin Braith has agreed to testify that the node lock protocol was implemented without proper board approval?" I felt a momentary pang of betrayal, quickly replaced by skepticism. I find that difficult to believe, considering Colin personally approved the protocol and insisted on its inclusion in our federal contracts. "We have a signed affidavit." "May I see it?" Jeremy interrupted. The attorney hesitated, then slid a document across the table. Jeremy reviewed it carefully before passing it to me. The signature didn't match Colin's, not even close. I had seen his scrawling, almost illegible signature on hundreds of documents over the years. This was a poor imitation. "This is not Colin Braith's signature," I said flatly, sliding the document back. The attorneys exchanged glances. "We have verification. From whom Colin has been in New Zealand for the past 6 months, working on a new startup. I had dinner with him via video call last week. He hasn't set foot in the United States since Virian's collapse, and he certainly hasn't been cooperating with whatever this is." I gestured to the affidavit. The lead attorney's face flushed. "We'll need to confirm this information." "Please do," I replied. "And while you're at it, you might want to consider the legal implications of presenting falsified documents during a formal deposition." That effectively ended the day's proceedings. As Jeremy and I were leaving, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Roof, 5 minutes, important." I showed it to Jeremy, who frowned. "Could be a trap, some kind of setup. Or it could be someone with information. I'll be careful." After Jeremy reluctantly departed, I took the elevator to the top floor and found the access stairwell to the roof. When I pushed open the heavy door, I found a woman standing near the edge, looking out over the Salt Lake City skyline. She turned as the door closed behind me. It was Patricia Yao, Virian's former head of government relations. She had left shortly after I was fired, citing personal reasons in her publicly announced departure. "Patty," I said, surprised. "You're the last person I expected to find up here." She managed a tired smile. "I'm not supposed to be talking to you. My severance agreement has a very strict non-disparagement clause." "Then why risk it?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. "Because what they did to you was wrong, and what they're trying to do now is worse." "What do you mean?" "The board didn't just decide to eliminate your position on a whim. They had been planning it for months. I was in the meetings where they discussed how to minimize the Hartley liability, as they called it." She handed me the envelope. "This is documentation of those discussions, including emails between Elena, Mason, and the board about how to avoid paying out your equity." I took the envelope, feeling its weight. "Why are you giving me this?" Patty looked away, back toward the mountains. "When I joined Virion, I believed in what we were building. Colin had a vision of using technology to make government work better, more efficiently, but under Elena, it became just another corporate machine grinding people up for profit." She turned back to me. "I left because I couldn't be part of it anymore, but that doesn't mean I can just walk away from the truth." "This could invalidate your severance agreement," I warned. She nodded. "I know, but I've got a new job starting next month with the state government. I'll be okay." She checked her watch. "I should go. They think I'm here picking up some personal items I left behind." As she moved toward the door, I called after her. "Thank you, Patty." She paused. "You know, when everything went down, a lot of us were rooting for you, the system protecting itself from them. It felt like poetic justice." After she left, I opened the envelope and quickly scanned its contents. It was a goldmine documented evidence of a coordinated plan to deprive me of my equity. including discussions about the optimal timing of my termination. There were even contingency plans for dealing with system issues, though it was clear they had drastically underestimated the robustness of the node lock protocol. I called Jeremy immediately. "We need to meet, now. I have something that changes everything." The documents Patty provided became the centerpiece of my legal strategy moving forward. Rather than just defending against Virion's accusations, we went on the offensive, filing additional claims for fraud, conspiracy, and breach of fiduciary duty against the board members personally. 2 weeks later, Virion's bankruptcy trustees approached us with a settlement offer that exceeded even my original equity valuation. They wanted the whole mess to go away, and they were willing to pay handsomely for it. After consultation with Jeremy and my financial advisors, I accepted. The settlement came with mutual non-disclosure agreements, which meant I couldn't discuss the specifics publicly, but the amount was substantial enough to fully fund Hartley Nexus Group's operations for the foreseeable future and secure my personal financial independence for life. More importantly, it validated what I had known all along. I wasn't wrong to build a system that could protect itself. In a world where corporate interests often override ethical considerations, sometimes the only defense is to design systems that can't be corrupted, even by those who claim to own them. 6 months after the settlement, Hartley Nexus had grown to over 500 employees with offices in Salt Lake City, Washington, D.C., and Austin. We had successfully implemented our new supply chain coordination system for 3 federal departments, with 2 more contracts in the final negotiation stages. Our commercial division was thriving as well, with clients ranging from pharmaceutical companies to food distribution networks. I had deliberately structured the company differently than Virion. We were a public benefit corporation, with a charter that explicitly prioritized ethical operation and public good alongside profitability. No single investor could hold more than 15% of the company, ensuring that no outside entity could gain controlling interest. And perhaps most importantly, our core systems were designed with distributed authority models, no single point of failure, human or technical. One crisp autumn morning, I was reviewing project timelines in my office when my assistant notified me of an unexpected visitor. "She doesn't have an appointment," he apologized, but she was quite insistent. "Who is it?" "Elena Bryce." I felt a momentary surge of anger, quickly replaced by curiosity. "Send her in." Elena looked different than when I'd last seen her. The designer suits and perfect hair had been replaced by more casual attire. She seemed thinner, with new lines around her eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. "Camille," she said, her voice lacking the commanding tone I remembered. "Thank you for seeing me." I gestured to a chair. "What brings you here, Elena?" She sat stiffly, hands clasped in her lap. "I've been doing consulting work since Virion, mostly small companies, nothing like what we had." I noticed her use of we but let it pass. "The thing is," she continued, "I've been approached by Meridian Systems. They're looking for a CEO, and they're in a similar space to Hartley Nexus government contracts, infrastructure management. The board is concerned about my history with Virion. Understandably, they've made it clear that having your blessing, for lack of a better word, would go a long way toward alleviating those concerns." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "You want me to vouch for you after everything that happened?" "I know it's a lot to ask," she said quickly, "and I wouldn't blame you for showing me the door, but I've had a lot of time to reflect on what went wrong at Virion. The mistakes I made, the people I hurt." She met my gaze directly. "I was wrong, Camille, about you, about the system, about what really matters in this business." "Why should I believe you've changed?" I asked. "Because failure is a better teacher than success ever was." She sighed. "I spent my whole career climbing ladders, hitting targets, impressing the right people. Virion was supposed to be my crowning achievement, the company I would take public, make billions, secure my legacy. Instead, it became a case study in catastrophic leadership failure." There was a raw honesty in her words that I hadn't expected. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she continued. Just an opportunity to prove that I've learned from my mistakes. Meridian is developing critical infrastructure systems. They need someone who understands both the business and the ethical implications of that responsibility. Someone who won't repeat the errors I made at Virion. And you think that's you now? I think I understand the cost of getting it wrong better than most, and I think that perspective has value. I considered her request. The easy response would be to refuse, to let her continue bearing the full weight of Virion's collapse. It would be justified, even satisfying in a way. But was it the right thing to do? What would you do differently, I asked, if you were given another chance? Relief flickered across her face at my willingness to engage. First, I'd respect the expertise of my technical team. I made the critical error of thinking I knew better than the people who built the systems, when in reality, I didn't even understand the fundamentals. She paused. Second, I'd prioritize integrity over expediency. The decision to push you out to avoid the equity payout was not just morally wrong, it was catastrophically short-sighted. She continued outlining the lessons she'd learned, and I found myself believing her, not because she was particularly convincing, but because her insights revealed a level of self-reflection that the Elena I had known was incapable of. When she finished, I said, "I'll tell you what, I won't actively endorse you to Meridian, that would be dishonest given our history, but I won't stand in your way either. If they contact me, I'll acknowledge that you've shown genuine recognition of past mistakes and appear committed to a different approach moving forward." It wasn't the full-throated support she had hoped for, but it was more than she had any right to expect. She thanked me and rose to leave. At the door, she turned back. "The system you built? It was remarkable. I didn't understand that until it was too late." "It wasn't just a system," I replied. "It was a philosophy about how technology and people should interact. That's what you missed." After she left, I stood at my window, looking out at the mountains that had witnessed the rise and fall of Virion and the subsequent birth of Hartley Nexus. I thought about the long, winding path that had brought me here, and the unexpected turns it had taken. I couldn't have predicted any of this when I joined Colin's little startup all those years ago. I certainly couldn't have imagined that being fired would ultimately lead to something better, stronger, and more aligned with my values than what I had been building at Virion. There's a certain irony in the fact that by trying to cut me out of the system I created, Elena and the board had inadvertently freed me to create something that surpassed it. Their short-sighted greed had been the catalyst for a new beginning not just for me, but for hundreds of employees and the federal agencies that depended on our work. Sometimes, the end of one thing is necessary for the beginning of another, and sometimes, the systems we build protect us in ways we never anticipated. The call from the White House came on a Tuesday afternoon, 18 months after Hartley Nexus had taken over the federal supply chain coordination contracts. I was in the middle of a budget review when my assistant interrupted with an urgent message. The president's chief of staff wanted to speak with me immediately. "Ms. Hartley?" The voice on the other end was crisp and formal. "This is Margaret Chen, chief of staff to the president. The president would like to meet with you tomorrow regarding a matter of national importance. Can you be in Washington by 9 a.m.? I rearranged my schedule and was on a flight to DRC that evening. My mind racing with possibilities. What could be so urgent that it required a personal meeting with the president? The next morning, I was escorted through the West Wing to the Oval Office, where the president was waiting along with the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and several people I didn't recognize. "Ms. Hartley," the president greeted me, rising from behind the historic Resolute desk. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, have a seat." After brief introductions, the president got straight to the point. "We're facing a potential national security crisis, and we believe your expertise may be crucial to addressing it." The Secretary of Defense took over, explaining that intelligence agencies had detected what appeared to be coordinated probing of various critical infrastructure systems across multiple sectors: energy, transportation, healthcare, and defense logistics. "We believe this may be the precursor to a large-scale cyber attack," he said gravely. The pattern suggests a sophisticated state actor, likely working with non-state proxies to maintain deniability. What does this have to do with Hartley Nexus? I asked, though I was beginning to see the connection. The president leaned forward. Your systems are the only major federal infrastructure that hasn't shown evidence of these probing attempts. We believe that's because the security architecture you've implemented may be inherently resistant to the methods being employed. We need you to help us understand why your systems are holding up when others are showing vulnerability, the Secretary of Homeland Security added. And more importantly, we need your help in developing countermeasures that can be deployed across other critical systems. I spent the next several hours in intensive briefings with cybersecurity experts from various agencies. The picture that emerged was deeply concerning a coordinated effort to map vulnerabilities in America's critical infrastructure, potentially as a prelude to a synchronized attack that could cripple multiple sectors simultaneously. What made our systems different, I explained to them, wasn't just technical sophistication, it was the philosophical approach we had taken to security. Most security models are based on centralized authority, I told the assembled experts. They rely on privileged access points that, if compromised, provide keys to the kingdom. At Hartley Nexus, we've implemented what we call consensus security. No single entity, including ourselves, has unilateral control over critical functions. Changes require multi-stakeholder consensus, verified through a distributed ledger system. Like blockchain, one of the analysts asked. Similar in concept, but with important differences tailored to our specific use cases. I explained. The key insight is that we've made the system resistant not just to external threats, but to internal ones as well. Even if someone were to compromise one of our administrators, they couldn't unilaterally alter system behavior. The discussion continued late into the evening as we explored how these principles could be adapted to protect other critical infrastructure systems. By the end, a plan was taking shape: the formation of a special task force, with me serving as a special advisor, to develop a comprehensive infrastructure security framework based on the Hartley Nexus model. As the meeting concluded, the president pulled me aside. Ms. Hartley, I understand you built this approach after experiencing firsthand how vulnerable centralized systems can be to human factors. I nodded, surprised by the president's knowledge of my history with Virion. Sometimes, the president continued, our most valuable insights come from our most difficult experiences. What you've created may help protect this nation from a threat we're only beginning to comprehend. I hope you'll continue to share your expertise with us. Of course, Mr. President, I replied. I built these systems to serve the public good. That's always been the goal. In the weeks that followed, I divided my time between running Hartley Nexus and working with the federal task force. We developed a framework that came to be known as the Distributed Infrastructure Protection Protocol, DIPP, which incorporated the core principles of consensus security while allowing for adaptation to various types of infrastructure systems. The work was challenging, but deeply satisfying. I found myself collaborating with brilliant minds from across government and industry, all united by the common goal of protecting the nation's critical systems, and throughout it all, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange journey that had brought me here. If Virion hadn't fired me, if they had simply honored their commitments and allowed my equity to vest, I likely would have remained there, continuing to refine Helix Grid, but working within the constraints of a corporate structure that fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the systems they were building. I might never have created the innovative security architecture that now formed the backbone of our national defense against cyber threats. Sometimes, I realized, what feels like your worst day can actually be the beginning of your most important work. The setback that seems devastating in the moment can be the very thing that propels you toward your true purpose. 6 months into the task force's work, we received confirmation that our efforts were having an impact. Intelligence sources reported that the probing attempts had significantly decreased, suggesting that the potential attackers had recognized the increasing difficulty of their objective and were reassessing their approach. It won't stop them forever, the Secretary of Defense cautioned during a briefing, but it's buying us time to implement the full DPP framework across all critical sectors. And time is the most valuable resource in cybersecurity, I added. Every day we delay a potential attack is another day to strengthen our defenses. As I left the Pentagon that evening, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert about Meridian Systems, the company that had been considering Elena for the CEO position. They had just announced her appointment, along with a new strategic direction focusing on ethically designed infrastructure systems with distributed security protocols. I smiled to myself. Perhaps Elena had truly learned from her mistakes, or perhaps she had simply recognized which way the wind was blowing in our industry. Either way, the principles I had fought for were spreading, becoming the new standard rather than the exception. That night, as I sat in my hotel room overlooking the Washington Monument, I received an unexpected email from Colin Braith. He had successfully launched his new venture in New Zealand and was planning a visit to the States. "Heard about your work with the feds," he wrote. "Not surprised they finally recognized what I saw in you all those years ago. Would love to catch up when I'm in D.C. next month. Maybe we can reminisce about the old days when Virion was just a crazy idea in a converted warehouse." I replied with genuine warmth, suggesting dates for dinner. Colin had been the one who gave me the opportunity to build something meaningful, who had seen potential in me when I was just another systems engineer with big ideas. Despite everything that had happened with Virion, I would always be grateful to him for that. Life has a way of coming full circle, I thought as I looked out at the illuminated monuments of the Capitol. 3 years ago, I had been fired from a company I helped build, watching as others tried to take credit for my work while denying me the rewards I had earned. Now, I was helping shape national security policy, leading a company built on my values, and watching those same values transform an entire industry. The system I had created at Virion had protected itself when threatened, ensuring its own integrity even when those in charge tried to compromise it. In doing so, it had also protected me, forcing a reckoning that ultimately led to something better than what had been taken away. Perhaps that was the most important lesson in all of this: the systems we build, whether technological or organizational, should be designed not just to perform functions, but to embody values. They should be resilient not just against technical failures, but against human corruption. They should serve not just immediate business needs, but broader social goods. As I prepared for the next day's meetings, I felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything I had experienced at Virion. I wasn't just building systems anymore. I was helping to reshape how we think about the relationship between technology, power, and ethics. They fired me on a Thursday, and in doing so, they inadvertently launched me on a journey that would change not just my life, but potentially the security landscape of an entire nation. Sometimes, getting pushed off a cliff is the beginning of learning how to fly. 3 years to the day after my termination from Virion, I stood on a stage at the National Cybersecurity Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. The audience was filled with government officials, industry leaders, and security experts from around the world. The topic: resilient systems building infrastructure that serves the public good. As I waited for the introduction to conclude, I reflected on how much had changed. Hartley Nexus had grown to over 2,000 employees with offices on 3 continents. Our distributed infrastructure protection protocol had been implemented across 12 critical infrastructure sectors in the United States and was being adopted by allied nations. We had successfully completed an IPO 6 months earlier, with a valuation that made my lost Virion equity seem trivial by comparison. More importantly, we had changed the conversation about infrastructure security. The idea that systems should be designed to resist not just external threats, but internal corruption had become a guiding principle across the industry. The notion that technology should embody ethical values and serve the public good was no longer seen as idealistic, but as practical necessity. And it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, the conference chair was saying, a visionary whose work has fundamentally transformed how we approach critical infrastructure security. Please welcome the CEO and founder of Hartley Nexus Group, and the recently appointed Special Advisor to the President's Critical Infrastructure Council, Camille Hartley. The applause was warm as I stepped to the podium. I surveyed the audience, noting familiar faces including, surprisingly, Elena Bryce sitting in the fifth row. Meridian Systems had become a respectable player in the industry under her leadership, though nowhere near the scale of Hartley Nexus. Our companies had even collaborated on a project for the Department of Energy the previous year, a partnership that would have seemed unimaginable in the aftermath of Virion's collapse. "Thank you," I began. 3 years ago today, I was fired from my position as Chief Logistics Architect at a company called Virion Systems. At the time, it felt like the worst day of my professional life. Today, I recognize it as perhaps the most important. I paused, letting the statement sink in. Because that experience taught me something crucial about the systems we build and the values they embody. It showed me that technology is never neutral. It always reflects the priorities, ethics, and power structures of those who design it. And it demonstrated, in the most personal way possible, that systems designed with integrity will protect that integrity, even against those who claim to own them. Over the next 45 minutes, I outlined the philosophy that had guided our work at Hartley Nexus and the technical architecture that had emerged from it. I explained how distributed authority models could create systems resistant to both external attacks and internal corruption. I detailed case studies from our implementation of depicted across various infrastructure sectors, and I challenged the audience to think beyond traditional metrics of success. The question we should be asking is not just, does it work, but who does it work for? Not just, is it secure, but what values does that security protect? Not just, is it efficient, but does that efficiency serve the greater good? As I concluded, I shared a vision for the future, one where critical infrastructure was recognized as a public trust, where technological systems were designed with ethical principles at their core, and where security meant not just protection from threats, but resilience against corruption. 3 years ago, a system I designed protected itself when those in charge attempted to compromise its integrity. Today, we're building systems that can protect all of us, our privacy, our security, our democratic institutions, our shared future. That's not just good engineering, it's our collective responsibility. The standing ovation that followed was gratifying, but what meant more was the knowledge that the ideas we had championed were taking root, spreading beyond Hartley Nexus to influence the broader technological landscape. After the talk, during the reception, Elena approached me. There was still an awkwardness between us, but the raw animosity had faded with time. "Impressive speech," she said, offering a glass of champagne. "An impressive company you've built." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the glass. "Meridian seems to be doing well, too." She nodded. "We're finding our way, different scale, different approach, but I like to think we're contributing something valuable. The industry needs diverse perspectives." "Indeed." She hesitated, then added, "You know, I still think about Virion sometimes, what we could have built if I'd understood what we actually had." "It's not productive to dwell on the past," I said, echoing her own words from that desperate phone call years ago. She recognized the callback and smiled ruefully. "Touché, though in my defense, I was in full panic mode that day." Understandably so. We fell silent for a moment, sipping our champagne and watching the crowd of cybersecurity professionals networking around us. "For what it's worth," she said finally, "I think things worked out the way they were supposed to. What you've built with Hartley Nexus, it's beyond what Virion could have become, even under the best circumstances." "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but that doesn't justify what happened." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't, and I'm sorry for my role in it." It wasn't the first time she had apologized, but it was the first time it felt genuine rather than strategic. I nodded my acceptance. "Second chances are rare in this industry," I said. "Make the most of yours." "I intend to." She raised her glass in a small toast. "To resilient systems and the people who build them." Later that evening, I returned to my hotel suite and found an unexpected package waiting for me. Inside was a vintage NASA mission patch, the kind Colin used to collect along with a handwritten note. "Camille," it read, "couldn't make it to your talk launching a new project in Singapore, but I wanted you to have this. It's from the Apollo 13 mission, you know. The one where an explosion nearly killed everyone until they improvised a solution that got them home safely. Reminded me of you. Sometimes the greatest innovations come from responding to catastrophic failure. Proud of what you've built. Colin." I smiled, running my finger over the embroidered patch. Apollo 13. The successful failure that had demonstrated how ingenuity and resilience could turn disaster into triumph. It was an apt metaphor for my own journey. As I placed the patch on my bedside table, my phone chimed with a message from my assistant. The president had requested a meeting the following morning to discuss expanding the DPI framework to include election systems ahead of the upcoming presidential race. This was the new normal, advising national leaders, shaping policy, building systems that would protect democratic institutions, all because a group of short-sighted executives had tried to cheat me out of my equity 3 years ago. I thought back to that Thursday when I had walked out of Virion for the last time, carrying a box of personal items, uncertain about my future but determined not to let them win. I couldn't have imagined then where that path would lead to the White House, to a multinational company, to a keynote address at the industry's premier conference. They had fired me to avoid paying what I was owed. In doing so, they had inadvertently set me free to create something far more valuable, not just financially, but in terms of impact and purpose. The system I had built had protected itself from their interference, and in the process, had protected me as well, forcing a reckoning that led to this new chapter. As I prepared for bed, I found myself feeling a strange sense of gratitude toward Elena, Mason, and the Virion board. Their short-sighted greed had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Without their betrayal, I might never have discovered what I was truly capable of building. They fired me on a Thursday, and in doing so, they launched me on a journey that changed not just my life, but potentially the security landscape of an entire nation. Sometimes, the end of one story is necessary for the beginning of another, and sometimes, the systems we build protect us in ways we never anticipated, guiding us toward the future we were meant to create all along.